This is the Concealed Carry Podcast, Season 14, Episode number 1. And welcome to the Concealed Carry Podcast, part of the concealedcarry.com network, brought to you by HK. Today is Wednesday, July 1st, 2026, as of the recording of this live episode. And I am your host, Riley Bowman, joined today by co-host Jacob Paulsen.
I'm here, feeling it, feeling the season 14. I'm feeling the, I don't know, just like the seriousness, importance of this episode.
Yeah, for sure. And our apologies to you listeners. We could have wrapped up season 13 in a little more, meaningful way. Like, hey, by the way, this is the end of season 13. But now now that one ended.
This
and now,
isn't daytime TV, Riley.
Now we are beginning number 14.
We don't need a cliffhanger.
Yeah, we do. Every episode should be a cliffhanger. We've got to get the people to come back for more. Today is a really special episode because we're going to go back to our roots in some respects with regard to the podcast. Our very first year of the podcast, our first Independence Day episode, we did a pretty thorough look at the events leading up to Lexington and Concord, specifically gun control that the British Navy and Army were trying to exact upon the colonials. And that was a fun time. And we replayed that episode for you last week. Well, it actually just went, it just published this week.
Yeah, it did.
Yeah, like on 2 days ago, I think, or something like that.
Yeah.
So that just went live. And so we hope you enjoyed that. That's a little bit more of an in-depth look at those specific events. But what we're doing in this special episode, in our 10th, now I guess you could say our 11th year of the podcast, because we are in the 11th year, and now approaching not just any old Independence Day, but a big one.
The big one.
Yeah. This is the 250th anniversary of what we deem the founding of our nation, the Declaration of Independence, our breakaway officially from the Brits, from England.
Yeah, it's heavy.
It's super heavy. It's a big deal. It's a big deal. And so today we're going to go back through history with you. Our hope is that we can share with you the story, the evolution of what led us up to and including and beyond the establishment, the recognition through a formal document of the right to keep and bear arms, which is a big part of that is a right to personal and self and community and defense of country as well. And we're going to go really far back. We're going to go all the way back to the 1300s even.
But we're also going to come all the way forward.
Exactly.
Now we're going to talk about major federal gun laws and Supreme Court decisions that have continued to shape and define what the Second Amendment means for us today.
Yeah. So this is really important. We hope, it's going to be, I don't know. I hope we can make it interesting. I know that some people are like, oh, a history lesson, like, oh, tune out now. But we hope that you'll stick with us and listen and learn along with us about all this very significant historical context, because I think it's super important to us as Second Amendment believing Americans to understand more about it and how it came to be and what it means, and understand, especially in the modern era with things like the Bruin decision.
Yes.
Back was it 2022, that has created this new framework that, part of that framework is looking at the historical context and what it means,
the analogs,
the Second Amendment, right? And so I think the better we can understand the historical context, then the better informed we'll be as gun-toting Americans. And so nothing more appropriate to discuss this as we honor the creation of this nation. So,
yeah, and I hope that we do it, justice, because we're not exactly professional scholars, but we care and we try.
That's a fair point. Should get that disclaimer out of the way. We are not constitutional law authorities or history, authorities or professors or anything like that. Just students of our own, making, that
Sure.
it's something we like and are passionate about and have done some research on, and hope we can share with you what we've learned. But first, today's episode is sponsored by our special Happy Birthday America sale. Jacob,
Yeah,
why don't you tell them about it?
it's super awesome. We do two big sales. I mean, we do lots of sales here and there, right? But we do two like kind of major sales a year. We do the Independence Day sale, we call it Happy Birthday America sale, and then we do the Black Friday deal like everybody else. So, our Happy Birthday America sale, this might be like our 8th or 9th or 10th year doing this sale. And it is open to the public, but it is certainly intended to particularly reward members of Guardian Nation. So you can go to concealedcarry.com/HBA to get all the details, regardless if you are or are not a member. Everybody is going to love the sale and save lots of money and get lots of cool stuff. But members are particularly rewarded. They get deeper discount on everything like they always do, and they also will receive special vouchers of store credit after the sale based on their purchases. But here's the big one, and this is what we think is really cool. Maybe you'll think it's lame, but I'm pumped about it.
Mhm.
And that is that this year during the Happy Birthday America sale, everybody who places an order during the sale period will receive a special 250th anniversary commemorative coin. And you can see pictures exactly what this coin looks like and everything just by going to concealedcarry.com/HBA. But needless to say, it is epic awesome.
Yeah, it is. I got my hands on it for the first time today. I actually meant to have it with me so I could hold it right up here to the camera. Those of
Yeah.
you that are viewing the podcast as opposed to listening only, it's awesome. It is spectacular in first person to be able to hold it. And first of all, it's a good sized coin. It's pretty large.
It's
It's
2.5
hefty.
inches, almost 2.5 inches in
Yeah,
diameter.
and it's hefty.
Yes, it's heavy.
It's thick, and it's just got beautiful engraving to it,
Yes.
showing a lot of the history, like things we're going to talk about today. In fact,
Yeah, I could I think of it this way, like that coin, one half of it is like America be awesome, and the other half is sort of like and guns be part of that.
Yeah, and it says on there, that how what's the phrase? Freedom bought with a gun, maintained with a gun.
Yep.
Which is kind of the title of today's episode. Freedom bought, freedom maintained. 700 years of receipts. Okay, we'll be bringing the receipts, and as I mentioned, we're going to go back all the way to the 1300s. That's where it's first recognized. In fact, some key modern day Supreme Court rulings referenced some of the earliest history here that we're going to be covering, and that's why it's relevant to today's discussion. But guys, don't forget and don't miss it. Okay, the sale, the Happy Birthday America sale, starts this week. Starts tomorrow, in fact, for Guardian Nation members.
Yep. July 2nd.
So July 2nd, the sale starts. concealedcarry.com/HBA. If you're not already a Guardian Nation member, you can join immediately and have access to that sale tomorrow. And so you probably want to consider doing that because, one, you're going to save the most. Not only get the extra 10% off of everything that's on sale, but you're going to also get that voucher post-sale. You're going to get a voucher where you can basically get another 10% back.
Yes.
Which is a big deal, right? So you're really saving 35%, if you want to think of it that way. On top, like it's across the board. You're going to get the super awesome commemorative 250th anniversary America coin. That's cool. So anyway, and again, that sale starts tomorrow, July 2nd. For everybody else, starts July 3rd, and you'll still save big. You'll still qualify for the coin and all that awesomeness. You just won't save quite as much if you don't want to be a member of Guardian Nation. But the sale starts tomorrow, July 2nd for Guardian Nation members, July 3rd for everybody else. Runs through the 5th of July, midnight, July 5th, sale closes.
Yeah, that's Mountain Time on Sunday.
Yeah. So concealedcarry.com/HBA. And if you want to become a member of Guardian Nation, go to guardiannation.com. Let's jump into history, Jacob.
Yeah. So English common laws, well, England is kind of a weird place, but we start, like you said, in the 1300s, and apparently with a concern, because this is a time when there's no guns, but there are weapons.
Yeah.
And so there's a concern,
Arms.
apparently, presumably, that people are intimidating or causing some disruption or unrest with their arms.
Yeah, it could be bows or crossbows or swords, knives.
I know it's not.
Doesn't matter. Okay, it's just referencing arms. Okay, so this is where this begins, because understand this, that even in the Bruin decision, okay, of the modern era,
Yep.
they referenced this statute, this old English statute from, get this, 1328.
Yeah, that's a minute ago.
That's a minute. Like, we're
Yep.
talking the better part of a millennia, of a
Yep.
millennium. Uh, the Statute of Northampton. Okay, so this was a law that was put in place in 1328, forbidding people from going about armed to terrify the king's subjects. And the reason why this statute was put into place was to make a distinction. So essentially, there was this presumption already that there was a context that people were carrying arms, okay,
Yes.
and that was permissible, but that this statute was needed to put in a clarification that what is illegal is to go about carrying weapons for the purpose of terrifying the king's subjects, the public, in other words. And so that law was put into place in 1328 to make that distinction, to say, hey, you know, you're packing around your knife or your bow and arrow or whatever, that's fine, as long as you are not terrifying the king's subjects.
Unless you're willing to forfeit your armor and your body to the prison of the king's pleasure.
Yeah.
So that was apparently the consequence of breaking this one.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is a package of laws. This whole riding while armed is one kind of section of it. But it would suggest that there's some issue with this. People running around armed, terrifying the public or something. So we have to say you can't do that anymore. You got to stop scaring people.
Yep. Yep. And so that kind of is, as I mentioned, the first recognition, as far as in some kind of law or statute, that an acknowledgement that there was this inherent right of the people to bear arms.
Right. Because it's assumed that people just have arms, and that's just stop intimidating people riding around with them.
Right. So as long as you're just going about your business, doing your thing, not bothering anybody,
Right.
no issue.
Or if they're in your
Right.
home, that's fine.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
If you're hunting, that's probably fine. Like there's a presumed assumption that like you can have them. We
Yep.
just need you to stop riding around intimidating people
Yeah.
with them.
So the key here is that the Statute of Northampton of 1328 established that bearing arms lawfully or legally was never disputed, but only in the manner of doing so menacingly. All right. So the Bruin case dealt with this by looking at how the statute established that historical precedent, that acknowledgement that, hey, this exists, the bearing of arms exists, essentially, is a right, a recognized right. There can be limitations. In this case, the limitation in England was, don't do it menacingly, don't menace the public, don't do it to intimidate people. All right, you may have your arms for lawful purposes, but as soon as you start creating problems for other people, then we got a problem. All right.
Yeah, you just set up the critical point here, so I'll just reiterate, right?
Yep.
That this established that there's a right, but there are circumstances in which that right can be restricted.
Yeah, we see that across the board with almost all the other rights.
All rights.
That
Right.
including in the Bill of Rights, so the freedom of speech, for instance, and right to assemble and worship peaceably.
Yep.
All
rights
those
can be
things
restricted.
can be done, but there are times and places and instances where, uh, you know, we don't want to be infringing upon other people's rights or causing problems, like running into movie theaters and yelling fire. Right. That
frowned
causes a
upon.
problem.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Okay. So that's what's interesting, is realizing that there was a standard created 700-ish years ago. It was just under 700 years, 698 years to be precise, that acknowledged the bearing and keeping of arms, but with some recognized limitations, such as don't terrify people. Now, it wouldn't surprise me at all, Jacob, knowing how uh, kings work, kings and queens, that things like this could also be used when it was convenient, or if they could say,
Sure.
hey, you're terrifying people, like whether you actually are or not, if the
Right.
king says so, it gives them a way to, hey, I'm taking your weapons from you, kind of thing.
This is not exactly a republic.
And so actually that's kind of a segue into the next kind of key moment in history, which is referred to as the Stuart era selective disarmament. I don't know where this came from, but what we're talking about here is really under the kings Charles II and James II. Okay, this is the 1660s to 1680s.
And for some context on this timeline, this is when like the British Empire is being born.
Oh yeah, I mean,
Right,
and it's
like we're
going.
having this massive expansion.
Yeah,
I mean, really, the beginning of the British Empire, as we think of it, is like the 1500s, and so now we're in the mid 1600s, and we are just exploding.
yep,
We are claiming territories and colonies, and I mean, it's hot right now.
right. The that what's the word I'm looking for? Kingdom,
Hmm. Hmm.
is going worldwide.
Yeah.
They're colonizing all over the place wherever they can, staking claims upon lands and
Yes.
oceans and seas
And establishing a
islands.
lot more standardization because of that, right? We
Yeah.
need to have more clarity of law, of the
Hmm.
magistrate, of what's the word I'm looking for? Sovereignty.
Hmm.
So those things become relevant at this time
Yep.
period.
You also have, of course, this is in that era too, or shortly after, uh, where you've got essentially the church, which is the Catholic Church. Of course, later becomes the Church of England. And the Protestant church, and that, of course, becomes and we're not going to go into that. That's not part of the discussion necessarily as far as that history. However, there is an important tie-in here, which has to do with the fact that during this time, the 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 king started to create, or Parliament started to create laws that specifically targeted
Yes.
certain people and classes of people.
Well, specifically Protestants.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like banning Glocks in California without using the word Glock. That's kind of what happened here. Is that these laws were written or established in order to prevent Protestants from having access to guns,
Yeah.
and simultaneously to ensure that Catholics did have access to guns. The church, it was church and state were one and the same. But
Yep.
it's really the American experiment was the first like government on the planet in a very, 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 in a millennia to decide to separate church and state.
Yeah.
So this is at a time when church and state is married, and that church specifically is the Catholic Church. And so the idea that all these Protestants are popping up and they're gaining some momentum and some popularity, well, them being armed is seen as a threat.
Yeah. Oh, we have a comment, by the way, from Brian Schuler on YouTube saying, I think the Three Musketeers had something to do with the passage of this law. Anyway, that's fun. Yeah. So this is where we start to see. Oh, go ahead.
Alexander
I could.
Dumas is a
Yeah.
genius,
Yeah.
and Three Musketeers. Have you read the book? Because the book is terrible.
Yeah. I had tried to read it when I was like 13, and I don't think I actually got all the way through it.
Yeah, it's a rough read by our modern context. Obviously,
Yeah.
at the time, highly successful
Yep.
book, along with his others as well, The Man in the Iron Mask and others. But the Three Musketeers is among the most the most adapted book to television of any book in history.
Mm,
I think there's like 3 books that have been adapted to television more than the Three Musketeers.
mm.
One of them is like Dracula. Dracula is the most adapted book
Sure.
to screen of all times, but Three Musketeers is pretty high up there. So anyway, I guess I just had to get my little Three Musketeers comment out.
It's a great story. I mean,
Yeah.
people love it.
Yeah.
Now, so back in 1662, there was a law passed called the Militia Act of 1662, which allowed royal officers to confiscate arms for anyone judged dangerous to the peace.
Yeah, at their own discretion.
Yep. So again, this is not all that different than probably the Statute of Northampton from the 1300s, but was probably for them at that time a more modern interpretation or variation of that, and giving them the opportunity or need or justification, I guess the word I'm looking for, to confiscate weapons, to take weapons from those they deemed dangerous to the peace.
Yeah.
The challenge is that this could then be interpreted to be, well, what's dangerous to the peace.
Those Protestants, apparently.
Exactly, right? And so
Those people who are a threat to the Catholic Church, those are the ones that are, that's dangerous. So take away their guns.
so that's exactly what started happening with King James II, was using this selectively against Protestants that he didn't like or disagreed with. Well, originally, really, he disagreed with all of them because they were not part of the national religion.
This is important because for one, we'll see this repeated with African Americans in the United States in the early days of the U.S. Constitution. But more importantly, it's because what happens today under Bruin, and we're gonna hit there eventually, is that gun grabbers who are trying to justify their anti-gun laws are looking for historical analogs to justify them.
Mm-hmm.
And so they look back at things like this, like, well, this law existed that was designed, to allow to remove guns from people, right? So does that make red flag laws, constitutional? But we'll see that the Supreme Court doesn't put up with historical analogs if those historical analogs were like evil and morally corrupt. And
Yep.
so that's come up many times in federal district courts and the U.S. Supreme Court, has basically said, well, I guess that's a historical analog, but that doesn't make it okay.
Yep. Yeah. So that's kind of how these laws started to be used, was with the intent of selectively going after certain people or groups of people. So to your point, I mean, this was used as gun control in the 1600s, but this is what came out of it, though, and that's what this sets us up for: is that the English Bill of Rights, passed in 1689, was a direct response to those abuses. And
Which is a huge win.
yeah, it was
Yeah.
right. It's not only in terms of what we're talking about here today with regards to Second Amendment type issues, but was a huge win for religious freedom as well in England at that time too, because it became, people basically started having enough of Protestants being the target of the crown, and hey, we need to put a stop to this, or at least try to put a stop to it. We know there were still a lot of challenges for the Protestant churches even after that time, but this was a start. And so the English Bill of Rights passed by Parliament in 1689, and in those Bill of Rights it said that subjects, the people, may have arms for their defense, suitable to their conditions and as allowed by law.
Yeah. In fact, I see this almost echoing the National Firearms Act, the Gun Control Act of '68 and the Firearm Owner Protection Act of 1986 in America. Sort of like, we went one step too far in controlling guns, and the pendulum had to swing back and kind of correct it. But also a piece of context I think here is relevant is think that like the Mayflower, right, the original Puritans that left England and became the first real true white settlers of the United States, in my opinion. They left in 1620, I think, or they landed here in 1620.
Yeah,
So
about then.
yeah,
Yeah.
so you got to put this in context of what's going on in England at the time, right? Like, there's this huge rise of resistance against the Catholic Church, and so the government's basically fighting against that. The king is fighting against that, and now it's starting to swing back out and say, wait a minute, like, we gotta respect the rights of people, including their faith, but certainly their right to bear arms. And so anyway, that's I just think some of that historical context matters.
Yeah. Isn't it remarkable when we look at this in the modern era? I mean, looking at it from the perspective of Brits, right?
Yeah.
Where they put in their own version of their Bill of Rights, the English Bill of Rights, the phrase that says that people may have arms for their defense. There's another part there I'm going to come back to in a moment, but acknowledge that people may have arms for their defense. And then today, contrast that with where the UK is today, where you're not allowed to have weapon for defense.
You can't even have a kitchen knife.
Right.
So
like you're told that basically I remember we covered this in the podcast several years ago, where like the only suitable tool at your disposal was like
a whistle,
or rape alarm or something to that effect.
Yeah.
So
Very
pretty sad
sad
to see how far they've really swung against, their old Bill of Rights.
Another piece of context that's relevant here is 1689 is this English Bill of Rights. So fast forward to 1773, 1774, 1775 in America, the English Bill of Rights is less than 100 years old.
Yeah.
And the colonists are feeling like, hey, we're not like we're being abused by the king. You know, this ain't cool. We got to deal with some of these things, the Tax Act and the Stamp Act and the Coercion Acts, et cetera. And so I just wanted to put that in context, right? That like we're talking about a timeline. In fact, 1689 to 1789 basically is 100 years from the English Bill of Rights being written to the U.S. Constitution being
Yeah.
affected.
Yeah.
So
That's pretty spot on.
some
Yeah.
context, right? And the U.S. Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, 1791. So 3 years after the English Bill of Rights. So anyway, I just say, to us, this is a
Yeah.
long time ago, but to the American founding fathers, the English Bill of Rights was not yet 100 years old.
Yeah. No, that's a good. I appreciate you pointing that out. That's a relatively new thing at that time.
Yeah.
And again, this is all context because this is the world that our colonials, those that became our founding fathers grew up within this framework. And by the way, it was Justice Scalia who wrote the majority opinion on the Heller decision, the famous Heller decision of 2008. And he noted in that the English Bill of Rights, specifically this phrase that people may have arms for their defense suitable to their conditions and as allowed by law, while that's not perfect, and while we've certainly in our own Bill of Rights went well beyond that as far as not having something like suitable to their conditions or even as allowed by law in our Bill of Rights with respect to the Second Amendment. But he noted that this part of the Bill of Rights acknowledged or creates this was evidence that the right predates, okay, meaning the right to bear arms predates and is independent to our own Constitution and Bill of Rights.
And the specific key here is this idea of for their defense. Because a common thing
Yep.
you hear from people today is, oh,
That's
the
a great
Second
point.
Amendment, it's all about militia. It was all about forming, creating, and standing up a militia. And so, it's not about an individual's right to have guns for their own personal, satisfaction or self-defense. And here it's like in 1689 it was. In
Mhm.
1689, the English Bill of Rights set forth that this was for the personal defense, for one's personal ability to defend themselves with whatever arm would be appropriate for that, that would within the scope of what's allowed by law. So this is setting forth that it's not just, hey, Americans, can, or this time the English people could own guns, but they can own guns for self-defense.
Yeah, that's that's such a valid point. And understand, I mean, we're gonna talk some more about Heller, of course. We're gonna give its own space, on this podcast today. But how significant that was, I think, is important to recognize that, as far as that Heller decision for the first time officially in our nation's history, very clearly pointed out the Second Amendment is about an individual right, protecting an individual right.
That's right.
And that's why this is so key, understanding this history and the English Bill of Rights and how it was about people, subjects to the king, people. We weren't talking about militias. Militias weren't part of this verbiage here. It was about people having arms for their
It
defense.
was about all people. In fact, that was
Yeah.
that was one of the points, right? It's like this is not about a select group of citizens. This is about all of the subjects of the king. It's
Yeah.
about all of them having this right.
Yeah. And I understand the English Bill of Rights wasn't perfect, and there was still a lot of class-based related issues and problems and challenges, but this was a step in the right direction. And this again is part of that framework that has established our own Bill of Rights here in our country, and again was used as that evidence for later rulings, super important rulings like that Heller decision that on record established, no, this is about an individual right. Super, super key. And so this is a recognition of where it all started for America. Okay. Let's turn our attention now a little more to America, Jacob. Let's talk about the colonies a little bit. Our own history, of course, is not without
Stains.
Yeah, and we're going to talk quite a bit more about that throughout this episode, even. But we we had settlement here of the American colonies. Okay, American people here are doing their thing. They're creating their lives. They're creating their own version of a country. I mean, they recognize themselves as subjects to the king, as part of that great kingdom. All right, the United Kingdom. But they were very much independent, and like I said, doing their own thing here, right? And so what's interesting is that by the time you arrive to that critical period of history, the late 1700s, 1760s, 1770s, the American colonialists are some of the most armed people in all of the world,
Big time. I mean,
right?
and for lots of reasons that are very practical, right? For one, there's a massive concern about the natives.
Yep.
For better for worse, the natives are seen as enemies of the people, savages that are dangerous, that will steal your wife and baby and burn your house down, right? So that's an issue. Then we have the reality of just food procurement.
Yep.
This is the wilderness. At least then it was the wilderness. I don't think you'd feel that way if you were hanging out in New York City today, but at the time, Long Island was the wilderness.
Right.
So, even as Manhattan became populated, so you got to think of it like, well, this is our primary means of getting food is the gun. And then you go beyond that, and certainly, the king is not going to pop over here on the weekend to help protect us from any potential threat. Other colonists from France or from wherever they might be coming, and so this idea of standing up a militia becomes really critical. For each community, for each group to have their own militia. We're talking about and this is where this one gets a little bit harder because some of these other ones we've talked about have been kind of, hey, the country of England did this, and now we're this kind of section of the podcast we're really suggesting that what you see is this trend of popular gun-related things across various colonies in the Americas
Hmm.
that served kind of two core patterns. The first pattern is one of almost, and in many cases, literally requiring
Yep.
that people owned a gun.
Yep.
That, hey, part of you being part of this colony, this community, this society is that you need to have a gun, and you need to be capable of deploying that gun, and sometimes a matter of minutes, and be assembling in a common area to be part of a community militia. And then the other pattern that's common here is we start to refer to the stain that I said, and that is this idea that we can't have slaves having guns.
Yep.
So hey, in our colony, I mean, in as early as like 1600s, you see slave codes being established in South Carolina. So these slave codes are established, and among these various slave codes, one of them is all about guns. No slaves can't, no touchy of the guns for the
Yep.
slaves.
Yep. Yeah, and so that's exactly where I was going with this discussion. It was to point out it here in the colonies. The colonies were really on their own.
Yep.
Right. There were some of the king's troops here,
Yes.
but the colonies, like already with 13 colonies, was already significantly larger than all of England.
Yes.
Right.
Way bigger. Like,
And
not even close.
and not only, and on top of that, the king has gone throughout the world establishing his kingdom. Like England is fighting wars all over the world throughout this part of history and claiming territories and islands
Oh
and
yeah.
uh, and so the English empire has just become so massive
That's
and
strong.
and very strong. I mean, it is the dominant force in the world at that time.
Largest army, largest largest navy on the
Maybe,
planet.
yep, exactly, yeah, and probably up to that point in history, right? And so it is the dominant force in the world, but that huge kingdom requires a huge force to just try to maintain,
Yes.
and it can't be everywhere all at once. And if there's a conflict going on somewhere in the Caribbean or in Africa or in India or whatever, like troops are getting sent there. So the point is like this is where the colonies are like, yeah, we are on our own to large extent to
Well,
defend our
and
communities.
there was a local government structure.
Yep.
The king would establish governors,
Yep.
that would be sent to be to rule over a colony or to establish a system of grievances and addressing those kinds of things. So yeah, I mean these colonies are established as colonies, and they are ruled by a governor appointed by the king or by
Yeah.
parliament, depending how you want to think of it,
Right.
to kind of manage that colony. So that's where you start to see some of these trends where these governors are like, "Hey, are you having this issue? Yeah, me too. Cool, let's do this."
Yep. Exactly. And so the colonies, have their own form of government.
Yep.
Each colony had a colonial government of some sort, managed by a governor. Uh, and as you already covered, there were laws in some colonies requiring the owning and bearing of firearms and weapons, requiring people to be a part of militia, because again, at any time they could be called upon because they're attacked by a tribe of Indians.
Yeah.
I mean, later in the mid 1700s, 1750s, 60s, you start having more conflicts with the French. Um, and so, yeah. And then, of course, on the flip side, where you've got laws that were passed to keep certain people, in this case specifically black people, from being able to possess their own arms. Let's fast forward now, too. We're jumping ahead, jumping around a little bit, but let's go now to 1774. Okay.
Yeah, so some historical context here. This is a rough time. Basically, the British have just crushed France again
Yep.
in a military campaign, in a war,
Yep.
and it was costly, it was expensive, and we need to get some money recovered from that. And those colonies in America, they are just crushing it. They are growing like crazy. They are putting out tons of crops and cotton, tobacco. I mean, they're doing so much good, and so there's a lot of wealth in the Americas. And over here, like we need to recoup. We kind of need to restock the fridge and the bank account, so to speak. So you see all these acts getting passed by Parliament to basically tax and burden a
Mhm.
little bit these Americans, which I think from the perspective of the king is sort of like that's like you're my subjects, like go do me the thing, man.
Yep.
But Americans don't like that very much. They decided, not just that we don't like these things happening, but that we have no say in them happening. There's good old taxation without representation. So you start to see a lot of conflicts, and the heartbed of this, speaking of turnarounds, is Boston.
Hmm.
And so Boston is this. This is the place of rebellion. This is the place where it's like we are not putting up with this crap anymore. So all these things start to come. Stamp Act and the tax on tea,
Yeah.
the coercion acts, all this is kind of coming boom, 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 boom. We have the Boston massacre
Hmm.
in '74 as well. So this is basically where
I thought that was earlier.
'73.
So I thought that was like, anyway.
No, anyway, I'm not sure. So this is
Yeah.
the Boston massacre is basically where you have a bunch of British troops that open fire on some protesters
Hmm.
and they kill a bunch of people, and we don't like that. We decided so anyway. This hostilities are kind of escalating, and so enter what we call the powder alarm.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you had the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Quartering Act,
Sugar
the
Act.
Townsend Acts. That was a big one, right? And all these things just stacked, 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 stacked. And the Intolerable Acts were
Intolerable.
passed in 1774, and a part of that was the Boston Port Act to shut down the Boston port, and basically punishment for what happened, during the Tea Party.
Mhm.
Okay, that was basically direct, just retaliation for the Tea Party, and so boom, we're punishing you, Boston. We're shutting down your port until you pay back uh, for the tea that you destroyed. Okay. You had the Massachusetts Government Act, which basically just stripped the colonialists of any of their own part in the government. Okay, so all these things just stack, stack, stack. The first Continental Congress was formed in direct response to all of these things,
Yes.
and in the midst of all this is where you've got the powder alarm, as you said, which was Boston's basically shut down. The port shut down. Okay, uh, they they actually the British raided a Boston powder magazine, is what it was called, but basically a huge storehouse of gunpowder.
Yeah, bear in mind at the time that gunpowder is volatile,
Yeah,
and so we don't store it in homes.
yeah,
We have
except for
powder,
small amounts. Yeah,
small amounts, but
right.
mostly you have these community powder houses
Yep.
where kind of
They're generally away from.
yeah, away from homes and things,
Yeah.
and that's where the major storage of powder is, so that if something goes wrong, you're not blowing up a bunch of houses.
Yep. And so, of course, there's all this tension between the colonialists, the Bostonians especially, and the Brits, the British troops, and their governor, of course. And so what starts to happen is they're like, hey, we got to get this tamped down. We got to go after the stuff that matters. In this case, we want to get a hold of that powder. So the Boston powder magazine is taken away. Okay, they raid it. All
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
and that's kind of like the first like clue into the colonialists that, hey, this is a tactic that they're starting to use. And so when they get word that they're heading for Lexington via or Concord via Lexington, right? Um, to seize that powder house, that's where it really kicks
Well,
off.
we know it's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
And in fact, there was another failed attempt to the north of Boston. I can't remember what that community was called, where they
Hmm.
tried to seize the powder and they failed. And so it's sort of like, hey, we know that that this is their game, that they're doing this right now.
Yep.
The intelligence was clear that they were headed to Concord next. It was just a question of like, when are they going and how are they going? So that's the good old, one if by land, two if by sea, the
Yep.
old North Church, etc. Paul Revere and William, whatever his name was, that went off and warned everybody.
Yeah.
So that's where all that goes down. Is this is all about protecting our ability to arm and fire back by keeping the British from taking our artillery and our powder and our arms.
Yep. The British know they have a problem on their hands
Yeah, big
because they're
problem.
way outnumbered, and they're
Yeah,
way outnumbered by an angry populace that is all armed.
yeah.
Right. And so where this is relevant in the discussion of the Second Amendment for our purposes today is that what do you do about that? Is you gotta exact gun control, right? And so when you have people that you need to control, to get them under control, you need to control their arms. And so that's really what was the tipping point here was, hey, we need to get a hold of all we can go confiscate guns. That's one thing, but what makes those guns run is their powder. We need to get the powder. And powder was difficult to manufacture. You had to have the right ingredients they're not available just anywhere,
Yeah.
right? And so if you can get a hold of the powder, then it doesn't matter how many guns they have,
And in fact,
right?
we basically never had enough powder throughout the entire American Revolutionary War.
Yeah,
Like
it
the
was
War for
constantly
Independence,
an
we were
issue.
constantly like low on powder,
Yep,
which prevented us from being able to train and practice and prepare and be a capable fighting
yep,
force. So anyway, yeah, it's effective technique.
yep, yep. So this is
This is basically British policy executed by the local authority, the governor, in order
yeah,
to tame a rebellion.
yep, exactly. Yep. That in itself, I mean, it explains the historical context of what led to the revolution, but it also frames for the purposes of our discussion of the Second Amendment, as like this establishes the historical context as well, that it was a recognized thing, like that people owned, kept, and bore arms,
Yeah,
that it was just a part of life, it was a
had to
part
be.
of society, it was something that everyone had a right to do. Okay. Except for in the case of blacks, like we already talked about. And in some cases, where I think Massachusetts was one of those states that required its citizens to have arms for purposes of participating in the militia. And so that also establishes this pre-constitutional uh, recognition of the right to keep and bear arms.
Mhm.
So that's why this is important historical context. I know we're preaching to the choir, but we want to understand the history here.
Well, the timeline matters.
And so, of course, we know what happens with Lexington and Concord. And you guys
Yeah.
just got a replay of that episode where we went into the specifics on the events surrounding that. So I don't know, we didn't need to spend a ton of time on actual Lexington and Concord, but hey, hurrah! Like the little skirmish at Lexington that's really what it was a skirmish. It wasn't a whole lot. Concord was a little bit heated, but what was really remarkable was the patriotic spirit was really you see that. I mean, I think it always and already did exist, but you see it in these patriots as they chase the British all the way back to Boston following Lexington and Concord, and they're just ambushing them all along the way. And I mean, I admire these scrappy men. That's the word I was looking for a moment ago. I was trying to think of this word. Like, how do we describe them? They were scrappy. They were tough, but it was a scrappy toughness that they were not an organized army. Far from it. They didn't have a lot of training. They were just hardworking Americans that said, "We've had enough, and we're willing now at this point to give up our lives and chase the British all the way back to Boston."
Yeah. I don't know if I can talk about this without crying. Just no hesitation. Right? Just they had already made the decision. Like when the call came,
Yeah.
no hesitation.
And we have to honor these folks of Massachusetts in that Boston area, especially for their part in the Revolution, because it, they really forced the hand of the rest of the colonies. I mean, the other colonies
Well, they
were
forced the hand of King George, and King George forced the
well,
hand of the rest of the
yeah.
colonies.
I mean, because as you find, and we don't, and we're not going to go into the actual war for independence and the whole, and the Continental Congresses and everything that happened there. But there was and of course, even drafting the Constitution, there was a lot of, you had 13 colonies, eventually 13 states,
Yeah.
that they all viewed this very differently. You
Yeah.
had certain colonies that were like, "Yeah, we're cool with, like, we don't like it, but we're still going to try to play nice with England." And others like Massachusetts, like, "We are done."
It was the center hub, right? So things spread out. I mean, it went from being like Bostonians
Yeah.
are all about this independence thing. The rest of us don't love it. And then it was about, well, those New Englanders are all about this independence thing. And then of course you have the Carolina campaign where
Yep.
Clinton runs down. General Clinton's a British officer, runs down to the Carolinas and tries to rabble rise a little bit. And all of a sudden the Southerners are like, "Oh, we're on board now."
Yeah,
Like
they're like,
that pissed us
"Oh,
off.
the fight's coming to us now?"
Yeah.
Like, yeah,
So
we're
it
in.
spread like a fire.
Yep.
That's really the takeaway.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, so now we're going to fast forward to the drafting and ratification of the Constitution, and of course, big part of that, the Second Amendment.
Yeah. So Constitution's getting drafted. Yeah, you can call it from 87 to 88. Is really kind of the ratification and signing of the U.S. Constitution, which initially, of course, has nothing in it about the right to bear arms. Um, and this was a highly debated topic. When James Madison and that whole contingency were meeting and drafting the U.S. Constitution, there was a lot of debate about a lot of these things, and it was sort of like, we can add those amendments later. Like, let's leave out anything that might be that might overcomplicate or lengthen the document. So
Yeah.
that's where, and it was also sort of like, those are the kind of things that could be enumerated later. And in fact, there were, if you go look at the Federalist Papers and some of these things, there were a lot of these I guess we call them states at that time, a lot of these states that basically didn't want to ratify the U.S. Constitution unless there was a promise of this Bill of Rights coming immediately thereafter. And so you really have the U.S. government, as we know it today, stood up in 1789
Yeah.
with President Washington. And
Yep.
immediately, like, we start working on the Bill of Rights.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. There had to be this compromise. You had the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. That was where this kind of sticking point was. The Federalists, of course, wanted a very strong federal government. The Anti-Federalists, not so much, more focused on states and state rights. And of course, we know it's not perfect, but I think what our founding fathers achieved in creating this nation and drafting our Constitution with its accompanying Bill of Rights did a remarkable thing to come as close as possible to perfect as far as checks and balances within a federal government and between federal and states. Not an easy thing to do. And
there's nothing else out there like it at the time.
Yeah.
Right? So they're really building from scratch. There were democracies and republics at this time, but they were all really tiny little governments, like little tiny colonies and things like that. There was nothing
like the
at this
Dutch, I
scale.
believe, were
Right.
a republic.
So
But
in fact, it was believed at the time that kind of a government system couldn't work at scale.
Yeah.
So yes, like what they did was absolutely revolutionary in so many senses of the word. They did so many things that had never been done before. I already mentioned one, the separation of church and state.
Yep.
So yeah, I mean, maybe I'm
Yep.
going too deep for this episode, but without question, yeah, like perfect. You may not think it is, but about as close to perfect. It must be pretty good since every other nation on the planet has basically adopted it since then.
Yep. Or a version of it, for sure. Well, and I only shared that because I think this context is important, and especially because if you had the Federalist way and like James Madison's, way, uh, we would have just had the Constitution, and I think eventually we would have had amendments added, but we would not have had the Bill of Rights, which has enshrined so many very core and key principles in our nation's government and constitutional structure. That would not have happened had there not been this compromise and eventually agreement to because you had multiple states that were holdouts essentially on ratifying the Constitution. They're like, we're not doing it, but you guys got to give us the word. We're gonna actually then work on these Bill of Rights. And so in 1791, the Bill of Rights is finally,
Yeah.
crafted and ratified as well. And thank, I'm just gonna say, thank God that happened, because if we didn't have, can you imagine what life would be like today if we didn't even have the Second Amendment?
Yeah, it'd be a nightmare.
Understand that, like, I think where the mind was at for some of the Federalists, and especially those that were like, no, the Constitution's good, man. As I think where they were at was they were thinking about all of the possibilities down the road. They were just like, and it's hard to do. It's hard to be forward thinking when you look at your world and you have all these assumptions and biases that you just live with. And to them, probably something as simple as the right to keep and bear arms was just a given, right?
Right. And it was this. Remember, the English Bill of Rights had been written basically 100 years before the U.S. Constitution was being ratified by each state. So yes, it was a given because it was a given. Like
Yeah.
as colonies of the British Empire, it was a given right enumerated in the English Bill of Rights, and so it was yes. Like I think that like how I would rephrase what you said from my own words would be that maybe the sense was we don't need to write those things out because we just all know that it's a thing.
Exactly.
And then you have states like, wait a minute, like if we sign this though, it's not good enough for us that there's an assumption. Like we want it in the document.
Yeah.
And so in order to kind of get the ratification process complete across all the colonies, the promise is basically made like, okay, you got it. Like we will just sign it and then we'll work on that. We'll get it in there.
I'm sorry, I'm chuckling a little bit because it sounds like the Obamacare bill where it's like, just sign it, just pass it, and then read and find out what's in it. But anyway, so that's kind of how this went down. And as I said, like, thank goodness that we actually ended up with a Bill of Rights.
Yeah, all 10.
And the Second Amendment as part of that. And it is the second thing that they included in that. I think it is appropriate. It's in the order that that the amendments are in the order that they are. First Amendment, free speech, right to assembly, right to worship. I think that is so important and so key and so core to our nation's founding and values as well. And then the Second Amendment, just like right on its heels, like this is important to us as a nation, the right to keep and bear arms, and it is an individual right.
Oh yeah,
And it is a right to defense. Okay.
I mean, it is the right of the individual to have the gun. It is the right of the individual to have that gun for self-defense. It is the right of the individual to go about their business on a day with that gun in tow in order to protect those rights.
Yeah.
Like these are the things that time has been required to prove that was the intention of that Bill of Rights. And of course that that's kind of where we're going next.
Yep. So Constitution, Bill of Rights are created.
1791. That'll be our next big 250th anniversary. Will be the 250th anniversary of the Bill of Rights.
Yeah, we should do something about that. And so that happens, and then things kind of go quiet for a while.
Yeah, yeah. Apparently, we don't have a lot of people running around shooting up schools.
Yeah.
So that's just kind of a non-issue, and not to mention the gun is allowing us to. I mean, the next century allows us to conquer a continent,
Yeah.
to become a superpower.
Right.
Like you could think of it like the founders of this country were handed a trust fund in the form of land and territory,
Yeah.
and man, we cashed in on that trust fund big time. But in order to do it, we used guns. And some of the things we did, another stain on America. We mentioned slavery. Another stain on the legacy of the founders, of course, is how we dealt with Native
Yeah.
Americans.
Native Americans. Yeah.
But putting all that aside, the reality is the gun was a necessary element for us to conquer a continent and to establish the first real. Well, I shouldn't say that a new order of a global superpower.
Yeah. It's an unfortunate reality that had we not marched west and conquered this nation, this continent, majority of a
Some
continent,
of it with money, some of it by force.
because I'm sure there's probably somebody out there even listening that would be like, well, I wish we hadn't, done what we did to the Native Americans. I'm with you there. We did horrible and atrocious things, but what happened happened, and they did things that maybe didn't have the knowledge we have today either, or an understanding. But you could suppose that we just stayed within the original 13 colonies, or maybe a slightly larger version of that. But somebody would have conquered. Like if we didn't do that, somebody would have filled that vacuum, right?
Sure.
I mean, Mexicans already had part
They
of
had
that,
some of that. We took it by
right?
force with the gun.
Right? But you know what I mean? Like if we didn't do it, somebody else was going to do it. Like that was going to happen one way or another. Anyway, but let's jump now to the mid 19th century, so the mid 1800s, and of course we know another stain on our nation's history. Of course, we already touched on it, was dealing with the rights of all people in America, and by that I'm specifically referring to Black Americans. Okay, and of course, there's the whole Civil War that took place as a big chunk, big part of that. But something led up to that specifically, and in 1857, you had the Dred Scott versus Sanford Supreme Court case that came before the court there. And this is important to acknowledge. We won't spend a ton of time on this. And it was something that kind of accelerated some of the tensions between North and South leading up to the Civil War. But the Dred Scott case was basically a case involving a slave who, through the laws were kind of complex back then, but his owner moved to Illinois, and he felt, and there was a law that after a certain amount of time, he could basically become a free man. Okay. And his owner was basically saying, no, that's not the case. You are not a free man. This man was basically suing for his emancipation, and for that of his family, his wife and his children as well. And so he went to the Supreme Court arguing this. Now, what the specifics of that case, we're not here to talk about, whether the merits of that case per se, but what was included in that case was kind of interesting, because in the opinion written by Chief Justice Taney at that time, he talked about the right to keep and carry arms wherever they went. That's a quotation. To keep and carry arms wherever they went, referencing one of the privileges of citizenship.
Yes.
Okay. And so basically one of the reasons why he could not rule, and why the majority did not rule in favor of this Black man seeking his freedom, was because that would mean that we therefore must grant to this man and his family all rights.
Yep.
And including the right to keep and bear arms. And we just can't have that happening.
Right. Like it was the way this is established in this case is that like there's full citizenship and
Yep.
there's partial citizenship. And being a full citizen of our wonderful country means you get all of these rights. And we don't want these Black people, speaking for the perspective of the Supreme Court at the
Yep.
time, the majority of the Supreme Court, we don't want these Black people to have all the rights, particularly the Second Amendment one. It sounds pretty scary if they get
Yep.
that.
Yep.
So therefore, we're going to kind of create this concept that Black people are not a full citizen.
Yep.
of the United States, and therefore they don't have a right to all of the rights that come with citizenship in this country. This is widely regarded to be one of the worst decisions the U.S.
Yeah.
Supreme Court ever made, and obviously it leads to some pretty nasty things. We come out of it better in the end, but there's also like a little interesting side note here that's worth pointing out, and that is that the Supreme Court in writing this decision, which was terrible for Black people and terrible in that respect, they also wrote it based on the assumption that citizenship in this country gave you the right to go about bearing arms, right? And so
Exactly.
that it's also like, yes, this is a problematic stance, and this decision was obviously overturned later with an amendment to the U.S.
Yeah, the
Constitution.
13th and specifically the 14th Amendment,
Right.
which granted all rights to all citizens.
But you can
Yeah.
look at it as, at the time, the precedent was citizenship grants you the right not just to own a gun, but to have it and go about with it.
Yep,
In
exactly.
society.
Yeah. So another important piece of this historical context that we're here discussing today, and that I believe was also referenced in the Heller decision, to basically show, hey, here is this historical context. And what was so key about the Heller decision was that this is an individual right, right? And that's the acknowledgement here in this Dred Scott case, in this majority opinion, uh, written by Chief Justice Taney, was that's where this individual right was in a way being referenced, that hey, here is an individual suing for his freedom, and if we grant him that, then we must also grant him this individual right of keeping and bearing arms.
Exactly.
So, super important part with those arguments that were made in the Heller case 151 years later. Then of course we know what happened. The Civil War of course happens. Horrible, terrible, nasty thing, but unfortunately was necessary, I think, to fight our way through these challenges and to, as you said a moment ago, come out the other side eventually stronger and better for it. Um, Immediately following the Civil War, so in 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed, and the 14th Amendment very, very shortly thereafter, granting all rights to all citizens, which now, of course, all citizens meant we are including all people, including especially Black people. And so
But
the
not women yet.
yeah, well, that's a topic for another day.
Yeah.
And so what happened? So this is an interesting thing. We have a section of history we're going to refer to as the Black Codes. This was like 1865 to 1866, and the reason why this even exists, and this is interesting to kind of note and point out, was that with the passage of the 13th Amendment, we now say all people, white, Black, whatever color you are, you're a citizen of America, a full citizen, right? And so now, hey, these are free people. And that must mean that it comes with rights. If they're citizens, they get rights, right? Well, you immediately start seeing different states, especially the Confederate, the Southern states, passing laws known as Black Codes to restrict as much as they could, as far as they felt they could, these new citizens' rights.
This is very equivalent to what we're seeing happening right now post Bruin.
Yeah.
Right?
Sort
Like,
of
oh,
this
the U.S.
repercussion.
Supreme Court says, all this stuff about guns. Well, then fine.
Yeah.
We're going to then pass this new gun law and this new gun. And then we got to go fight the same kind of thing then, where it's like, hey, we've decided that, these Black people are citizens and therefore as such, they get all these rights. Okay, well then fine. Then we're going to restrict this, and this, so far as we can within our state.
Yep.
So a similar kind of thing happening at that time. And devastating, I might add. I mean, it requires more civil rights reform down the road to clean this up.
Yeah. Specifically, you had states like Mississippi and South Carolina that passed laws that specifically barred freedmen from owning or carrying weapons. They didn't totally say that you couldn't do it, but part of that was you got to have a license to do so. And then, of course, what do? They make those licenses dang near impossible to get.
Yeah, sounds familiar.
Yeah, strange, right? Right. So, and so that's what happened almost immediately after the 13th Amendment, before Reconstruction protections were in place. So that's where the 14th Amendment was an answer to a lot of this, because it just needed further clarification. Like the 13th Amendment basically said, hey, all people, are now citizens and are free. And it was sort of like what we were talking a moment ago. Now there's this assumption that means all citizens get the same rights, right? Right?
In theory.
But that's not how it was actually being implemented. And so the 14th Amendment was that amendment that now was like, no, we need this to specify. Because what does the 14th Amendment say? I can't quote it exactly, but it basically says that no government shall restrict the rights of any citizen, right? And so, and of course, there's the due process clause and other things that are part of that 14th Amendment. But that was a big part of it, was this clarification that no, this means all citizens have access to all of the same rights. And so that's where the 14th Amendment comes from. So then, and the other thing, if I recall in some of my research, Jacob, there was even some debate about some of the verbiage in the 14th Amendment. And that went back and forth a little bit. But at one variation of the 14th Amendment had, I think, something more specific regarding the Second Amendment. But the way that, let's see here, I had a quote here from the 14th Amendment. I might not be able to pull that up now off the top of my head, but
in the end, it was just decided to be unnecessary to have it in there.
Right. And so anyway, but there's my point I'm trying to make here is that it's important to see that the 14th Amendment. Oh, I think that this is some of the tie-in I was looking for, Jacob. Was that the 14th Amendment? It's clear in reading the text of the 14th Amendment that it is applying to individuals, not a collective right, and that must also therefore mean that, kind of sort of indirectly, we're also suggesting that, again, or reinforcing the idea that things like the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, and so on, we are talking about individual rights. And so the 14th Amendment is reinforcing these individual rights. And therefore, that's another context piece to where we're trying to lead to today. So we get into this part of history, and we're going to talk about that some more here in a moment, where it starts to become interpreted that the Second Amendment was more about militia and this collective right? And we had to have this Heller decision, this famous Heller decision, to really make that distinction. No, this is still an individual right that we're talking about here. But before we get to that, let's talk now about the Colfax Massacre and United States versus Cruikshank. This is in the 1870s, Jacob.
So this is a massive setback because the context here is you basically have a group of free black men defending a church that's it's all part of an election drama thing, and so you have a white militia that kind of starts to march on the church, and the black free men. Back then we called them free men, like we're trying to clarify that they are in fact not slaves. Anyway, they defend that church, and the conflict kind of ends in a surrender where the black dudes are like, hey, okay, we'll put the guns down, kind of thing.
Right.
And after they surrender, a bunch of them are slaughtered. They're just shot dead.
Yeah.
So a local jury basically convicts these dudes. Well, it goes through a process. They were convicted, but then there's some appeals, and it goes all the way up to
the Supreme Court.
The Supreme Court overturns their convictions and says, nope, like they're good. And I've not read that decision. I don't know all the details, but it's a massive failure, because what it basically did is it said, hey, we're not changing the fact that you have these rights and these rights exist, but we are going to basically stop enforcing them. We're going to stop backing you up when you try and exercise these rights. It really kind of set up the future several decades of Ku Klux Klan activity, and really put the African American community in a very vulnerable spot, because they had no legal recourse when their rights weren't recognized.
Yeah. Hey, before I got some commentary on that, we got Project 1868 commenting on that right now on YouTube, saying for two comments. One man with one gun can control 100 men without guns. Touche. Very true.
Depends on the gun.
Fair enough, but it's a great point. But then he says in a follow-up comment, for obvious reasons, I love the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868. says Project 1868. So I'm glad you're joining us here today, Project 1868. Thank you for your comments. Yeah, this Crookshank case, Jacob, is as you mentioned, a terrible ruling, a big step back. The key to this ruling is essentially that the Supreme Court said that things like the Second Amendment uh, only apply to Congress or the federal government being restrained from restricting those rights, and that it didn't apply to states or individuals. And that was the key difference here, is that essentially these men that murdered, that massacred these black men, these white men that massacred these black men in the Colfax massacre, they were just a loose private group of militia. They weren't a part of any government. They weren't part of the state. They weren't part of any you know official organization. They were just a private group of white men militia that did this act. And so the reason the Supreme Court essentially overturned their convictions was because they're like, hey, they these were private individuals acting against these other private individuals, and the Second Amendment in this case, we're talking about on the Second Amendment issues here, don't apply, because that only really applies at the federal level. Okay. Now this came from, I had to do a little digging on this, Jacob, because I was like, this is really strange to me. And there's actually an earlier case in 1833. This was not a Second Amendment case, but was a case that was dealing with some other Bill of Rights issues. And in the Barron versus Baltimore case of 1833, that case established that the Bill of Rights only restrains the federal governments, not state governments. Okay, so the theory was that the Bill of Rights was added specifically because people feared a powerful new federal government,
Sure.
but states still had their own constitutions to govern and police themselves. And so that was kind of, and this became sort of this new interpretation of, and the, I mean, again, we're talking 1833 now up to 70 something, 1873, 1876. Okay. So this is the interpretation now at this time in the federal court system, is that, hey, Bill of Rights, Second Amendment, that's a federal thing. We're talking about a state or an individual that matter. It doesn't really apply. And so that's where you start to see the beginning, this creeping in of, well, that's not talking about an individual right, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that becomes a,
I mean, it sounds crazy to us today, right? Like,
yeah,
like we hear that, we're like, what?
yeah,
Like, the Bill of Rights is not enforced at the state level. What are you talking about?
yep,
Because it's about sovereignty
yep.
and the nature of kind of how that's evolved over time.
It wasn't until the McDonald versus Chicago case 134 years later that this was fixed. That was specifically an individual versus a city in that case. So, and for that ruling to then say, hey, no, we're not just talking about federal government or Congress being restrained. We'll come to that here. We'll give it its own time as well. Let's now turn to the National Firearms Act, 1934. There's not a whole lot that happens. There's probably a few things here and there, but as far as significant cases or events, we don't see a whole lot from this point forward until we get to 1934 in the National Firearms Act.
Yeah, 1934. So this is Prohibition era, right? Time, and kind of the rise of mobsters and gangsters in American society, right? People who are bootlegging and kind of enforcing their own rules. And so we're the U.S. government decides they got to take some action to try and minimize the potential damage that these groups can do. And so they look at the types of guns and things they're using and say, hey, let's regulate the tools that only these mobster type groups can afford and use,
Mm-hmm.
and let's manage that.
Yep. Yeah. And so, we come up with this legislation, the National Firearms Act of 1934. And let me say this, Jacob. The NRA was a part of this.
Yes.
Yeah. Uh, And,
By a part of this, you mean they supported it? They
very much
endorsed
so.
it.
And not only that, but the president, I think it was the president of the NRA at that time, was key, and I think testified on behalf of this, and specifically, I think advised on this legislation from the standpoint of they knew they couldn't just say, we're going to take away these guns, like these whole classes of guns. And so they knew the way they knew they had to frame it was through the tax stamp, the $200 tax stamp that we're all familiar with
It's a
today.
financial bill.
Yeah. So Congress didn't have the right by the Constitution. They didn't have the authority to just say, take these guns away. Okay. What Congress has the authority to do, though, was pass a tax. And so they didn't totally make illegal these classes of firearms. They just said, hey, to get these guns, you have to go through a process and pay a tax. And we have the authority to do that tax, and therefore we have the authority to do this. And that's where the NRA and the president of the NRA at that time came into play, is in actually saying, here's how you can get this done, legally and constitutionally within the bounds of the authority of Congress. And so that's an interesting part of history. Now, there was not a lot of pushback on the National Firearms Act at that time.
No, it went through Congress without much pushback. And for those who aren't following, and today we often just refer to this as the NFA.
Yep.
So this is the law, Title II, class that established what a Class 3 weapon is, and these Class 3 weapons were again not banned; they just required a purchase of a tax stamp to acquire.
Yep.
And so these are things that you're familiar with today. Obviously, suppressors are part of this list.
Yep.
Sawed-off or short barrel
Rifles,
shotguns, and
machine guns,
and then fully automatic machine guns. And so, bear in mind that $200 then, according to my little quick Google search I just did on my phone, is about the equivalent of $5,000 today.
Yeah.
So this is you coming up with $5,000 to pay a tax stamp to be able to acquire that tool.
Yep. Which there's some irony in that, because you'd think that some of those gangsters and mobsters, partly, especially the more organized ones, would probably have the resources to pull that off.
Yeah, probably not a problem. Yeah, people love
or they would just, because they're criminals anyway, would just not abide by the law in the first place. But anyway, because since criminals follow laws all the time. But here's one other thing. I brought the NRA into this discussion. There's one other thing that's important to point out, and that is that the NRA was responsible for making sure that handguns were not included in the NFA. The handguns were originally included in that.
In the first proposal.
Understand that the context of society at this time is that guns are still a very popular thing. Most households still own one or several, but they don't typically own them in the context that we think of them a lot of times today, as far as like for personal defense, especially. That's not really a thing at this time. People aren't really like, I think there's some instances of it, but it's just not as common that people are packing around a revolver, or I guess it could be 1911 at this time, because those certainly existed. They're not packing around a handgun as part of their normal day-to-day lives. Most households, they think, hey, I have my guns. I've got my rifle, my hunting rifle. I got my hunting shotgun. I have my 22. I got what I need, right? And so most people did not see the National Firearms Act as being something that was coming after them or coming after their guns. They didn't own machine guns. They didn't own short-barreled shotguns, because who hunts with a short-barreled shotgun?
Well, those were expensive firearms. I mean, think Tommy gun, think fully auto submachine gun.
They weren't that expensive then, but
relatively, I think.
But I think it's more about the people didn't see a practical use for them.
Yeah.
And so why would I have a short-barreled rifle? Why would I hunt with a short-barreled rifle? That doesn't make any sense. That just reduces my velocity. It's going to make my hunting rifle less effective, and so forth. But handguns were part of that, because also, again, gangsters, mobsters were using handguns also. So that was another one of the things they were going after. But the NRA did win on that point to say, hey, there are still legitimate uses where citizens have handguns for personal defense, and they stripped that out of the NFA. Thank goodness. Thank goodness. If we were still having to fight the NFA fight today on handguns, that would be, ugh. So that's the NFA. That's how it came to be. And it didn't have much pushback against it. Most people were in support of it, sadly. We regret that now for sure, don't we?
Well, and as recently as the last 12 months, we've seen the $200 tax stamp be removed.
Yeah.
So as of January 1st, 2026, we've reduced the tax on NFA items from $200 to $0. And one of the biggest pro-gun efforts happening today is the initiative to either abolish the NFA completely or at very least to remove suppressors from it.
Yeah.
So those are hot topics right now.
Yep. Now, one thing that the NFA did set us up for was a case known as United States versus Miller. And the Miller case was used for anti-gunners and still is today as their evidence for a lot of different things over the years.
Yeah, made a mess.
And it's good. It's important to understand what went on with the Miller case. Okay, so essentially, you had a situation. This man got caught with a short-barreled shotgun. Okay, just a little. It's probably one of those situations, right? That by the NFA law, you're right. Your shotgun's got to have a barrel no less than 18.5 inches, right? And by golly, if you accidentally took a little too much off that shotgun and you're 18.49 inches, well, you're in violation of the law, right? So you got a gentleman, he's caught with a short-barreled shotgun. He's convicted. He takes it up to the Supreme Court. But something about that case, for some reason, he didn't show up and defend. Like there was no defense to this case.
Yeah, he just no-showed.
Yeah.
Probably was in Mexico by then. I made that up.
So that's the important thing about Miller that you need to understand is that you end up with this Miller decision that was then used as for other court, used as case law for other future federal court cases for decades. And it was a case that had zero defense. Nobody showed up. Nobody argued against it. It got pushed through.
Yes.
And so that's how the Miller case ends up being this decisive for several decades court case about clarifying. So what that part of what that had to deal with too was there was a tie-in with militia service. Okay.
Yeah.
And so again, this removal of individuals from the picture of this Second Amendment picture, but it's got to be relevant to militia service, and so that's how this came to be, this Miller decision.
Well, and this is not necessarily the U.S. Supreme Court saying, "Hey, the shotgun has no application of militia service. The Second Amendment's about the militia. Therefore, what happens here is there's an appeal made. The U.S. Supreme Court agrees to hear the case, and the case is basically what the prosecution wrote. So
Yep.
again, no defense,
Yep.
right? So the state comes and says, "Well, you should uphold this guy's conviction because we arrested him on the shotgun, and the shotgun's not needed for the militia, and the Second Amendment says militia, so therefore we should win." And the Supreme Court says, "Okay, well, what's your side of the story, Mister? Oh wait, you're not here. Okay, well then, smack the gavel. That's the deal."
Mhm.
And so this is used, yes, by anti-gunners, up until and including today, to say, "Hey, here's a U.S. Supreme Court decision where the decision was all about what's appropriate for militia use." And so, does a militia need this or not? And clearly, this is indicative that it's not about an individual; it's about a militia.
Yep. Yeah. Exactly. And as we've already established in this episode so far, as we've given numerous examples going back to hundreds and hundreds of years, where is a recognized individual's right to have and bear arms.
Well,
So
it does self-correct.
It does. It does. Of course, Heller, huge deal. McDonald's, another big deal. Bruin, huge deal. We're getting to that. But first, we've got a couple other things. Let's talk now about the Civil Rights era. The Mulford Act, 1967, Jacob. You had California banned the public carry of loaded firearms. Okay?
Shocker.
Yeah, right.
California, right here.
Now, this was in direct response to, you had a lot of civil unrest at that time, and the Black Panthers became this huge movement, this huge organization. And Black Panthers started doing these armed neighborhood patrols, okay? Which I would say, by the way, they had every right to do, okay? Just I would say
Absolutely.
every American has a right to do. If they decide that that's something, that you got to do something, that you got to take action to protect your neighborhood, you want to have an armed patrol, I'm all for that. Okay. But the Californians didn't like these armed neighborhood patrols. And so they signed legislation. In fact, this was backed by the NRA again
Yes, NRA
and
backed this one
signed
up.
by Governor Ronald Reagan. But this was specifically targeting these Black Panther armed neighborhood patrols to keep them from being able to do that, because this just banned outright a public carry of loaded firearms. Period. So it did go across the board, but I think the way this was viewed was, well, not many people generally carry loaded gun publicly, but these Black Panther folks are doing it, in their little neighborhood patrols. So what can we do to go after that? Let's just ban outright the public carry of loaded firearms.
And in modern language, we would address this as open carry.
Right. Exactly.
So
Yeah.
to be clear, like it's not, this was, in fact, we've seen what's the 2026 case, Barrett versus Bonta.
Yep.
So that's a 2026 federal district court ruling that pointed back to this law from 67 to justify the ban on open carry. So yes, this is an open carry ban, specifically targeting these Black Panther neighborhood patrols.
Yeah. You're probably picking up on a couple of things, some hints that there are pluses and minuses on both sides of the aisle, I guess you could say, as far as on conservative side and more liberal side, or Republican versus Democrat. I don't care how you want to phrase it, but you've got mistakes made on all sides, on all sorts of issues throughout history, with regards to even Second Amendment issues. All right. The Gun Control Act of 1968 was the next piece, and this sort of is kind of that next step up from the NFA, right? And some of the kind of catalysts to the Gun Control Act of 1968 were things like the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Robert F. Kennedy. Okay, those happened close, like boom, boom, in timeline in history, and people are like, oh, dang, like we got to do something about these people just running around with guns and assassinating people, right? And so that's where the Gun Control Act came to be.
And you note that most of these things we're talking about, when we get into American time, post-U.S. Constitution, we have very few actual federal laws. In fact, we really had the NFA, now the Gun Control Act 1968, and then we're going to have FOPA in 1986. But we just don't have a lot of federal. Most of it's about court cases. That's how most of these things get sorted out. Yep. This is a big one. And what it does, like in terms of what Gun Control Act actually does, it kind of establishes two core things. First off, it creates the Federal Firearm Licensing Program, the FFL program. So it establishes the idea of gun dealers, that we're going to have people come to us and get a license in order to be engaged in the business of selling firearms.
Yep.
Something that's already being sorted today.
Up to that point, you could still mail order firearms.
Right. Yeah. It's all good. Like they could they were in the Sears catalog probably.
Absolutely.
If Sears was around, I assume they were.
Yeah.
So yeah, now we're going to like, oh, no. Like, I mean, we're not going to regulate individual, like, hey, give a gun to your buddy or your neighbor or sell a gun to your friend. But we are going to regulate people who are going to be in the business. So that gun store, we are going to regulate what the gun store can do. So we create a system to license gun dealers, and then we regulate those dealers. We also create a classification of people who are prohibited from buying and possessing guns. Yep. People who are mentally ill or have been convicted of felony, all these kinds of things. Yep. So we create all those requirements. Now we don't really have any way to enforce them other than to tell the FFL, hey, you can't sell guns to these people knowingly.
Yep, exactly. So that's essentially what happens with the Gun Control Act of 1968. Yep. And that sets us up for a contrasting piece of legislation known as the Firearm Owners Protection Act of 1986.
Yeah.
And so some of what happened with the dealer registration and licensing in 1968 was there was a whole bunch of regulations or rules for how dealers were to conduct business, which turned out, and this is no surprise to really anybody, I'm sure, but the government started to use some of those regulations to really go after dealers.
Persecute.
There you go, persecute, and just Yeah, so it made things really difficult as a dealer, right? And so the Firearm Owners Protection Act helped roll back some of that and make things a little bit less crazy on the dealer side. The other big thing, though, was that interstate transportation of firearms. I think that was also part of the Gun Control Act of
Yeah.
1968.
Yep.
That became um, I don't know what I don't know what the exact limits were, but basically you couldn't. What was the law? Do you know on
So
that?
Article 926A.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this the way we utilize or think about this as it applies to us as individuals today is not the way it was intended back then. This was really about like, the mass transportation of guns from one state to another. So if guns were being manufactured in New York or Massachusetts or Connecticut, which is where most guns were
Yeah.
manufactured back
Yeah.
then, but we wanted to ship those to Florida to a gun dealer so they could be sold to consumers. This was a problem at the time because Florida's laws might be different than Connecticut's laws, and so the part of FOPA was to step in and say, hey, we need to create some federal allowance that firearms can be It's part of a commerce bill.
Yeah.
This
Right.
particular amendment to the Firearm Owner Protection Act is part of a U.S. Department of Commerce and Transportation bill, and so it established that part of free commerce is the ability to move guns from one place to another.
There we go. That's where we're trying to get to with that. Appreciate your explanation on that.
There's some other important critical parts of FOPA, in addition to kind of pulling back a little bit some of the strenuous requirements on FFLs. FOPA also establishes that it's a criminal act for a government, local jurisdiction, state, county, whatever governing body or organization to keep a database or a list of gun owners and their
Hmm.
guns. So this establishes basically a protection against gun registration,
Hmm.
which is really important. And of course, today we see that there are still some jurisdictions doing it, but they were doing it prior to 1986. And so they kind of keep getting away with doing it. But establishing a new database of gun owners and their guns post 1986 is strictly prohibited
Yeah.
because of the Firearm Owner Protection Act.
Yep. Now, there's this thing called the Hughes Amendment that was
Yeah.
a part of that. It was never really intended to be a part of that. Um, Now, understand the Firearm Owners Protection Act was rolling back some of the legislation or regulations and laws that were put in place in 1968. And you had certain individuals, especially on the left leaning side of the aisle, that weren't exactly in favor of doing that because they'd rather just constantly march forward on taking, and restricting things more and more, right? The Hughes Amendment, it's interesting how this came to be. It was thrown in the last minute. And it was done in such a way that, in fact, Mr. Hughes, I don't even think in the end, we actually don't know because the whole Firearm Owners Protection Act bill was passed on a voice vote. There was never even a recorded vote. We don't know who voted in what way for or against the FOPA bill. Okay. And the Hughes Amendment was slipped right in there at the end. And again, like, and there's actually debate today, Jacob, about whether it was truly enough yays versus nays in passage of the FOPA Act or bill along with that Hughes Amendment. Because there are those that say that the nays were a lot louder than the ayes
They're
or
welcome
yays.
to go write a new piece of legislation to repeal it.
And it actually was challenged in court, but came back saying basically like, yeah, the court basically said, hey, whatever um, the I'm at a loss for the word all of a sudden.
Let's talk about the Hughes Amendment. Oh,
Whoever
sorry.
certifies the bill, we will talk about it. Whoever certifies the court basically came back and whoever certifies the bill, like they're like, yep, that it is what it is. It's a done deal. Like it's passed as far as we're concerned, and assuming it's signed by the president.
Right.
So it's a law. Like there's nothing we could do about it. All right, Hughes Amendment.
Sad. It's tragic.
Yep.
The Hughes Amendment basically freezes the the legal sale of newly manufactured non-semi-automatic, fully automatic firearms, machine guns to civilians.
Mhm.
So it's created an interesting environment where it's a weird law because it doesn't say you can't buy and sell machine guns. it says you can't, as a civilian, non-military, non-law enforcement, that you can't buy or sell machine guns that were manufactured post 1986 when this bill was passed.
Mhm.
So this is why a machine gun made in 1985 is a very good thing to own today. It's worth a lot of money because it can still be sold in as long as you're compliant with the NFA.
Yeah.
But it can still be sold, transferred among private citizens, whereas a machine gun manufactured in 1987 cannot. It's
Yep.
exclusively available for military and law enforcement use.
Yeah. And that's the Hughes Amendment. This is what I was trying to say. Certified by the Speaker. You have it, they call it the enrolled bill rule. The 11th Circuit ruled this when this was challenged in court. They upheld the law invoking the enrolled bill rule, saying that once a bill is certified by the Speaker and signed by the President, it's considered law, and the courts won't look behind the legislative process that produced it. So there you go. Here's the other thing. Back to the, I'm not the intent is not make this an anti-NRA episode at all. Okay.
But of interesting note.
And I know that there are those of you already out there that know some of this, this back history and backstory. But the NRA was also on board with the FOPA. Of course, it was rolling back some of the legislation passed in 1968.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. Like, yeah, we're on board. They were willing, it said, and Wayne LaPierre was involved in this. He was a lobbyist at the time for the NRA. Was willing to let the machine gun ban go forward rather than risk the whole reform package. It was just sort of considered to be a risk versus reward, kind of approach. Like, that's a small thing. We need these other things. These other things are more important. It was a strategic play. And so whatever you think of that, you can think of that what you will. Just know that, the NRA was playing a part in that. So, all righty. Let's now move to Brady. Yes.
So this is the next big one. And a lot of the Brady bill was ultimately sunset and went out of business, but some of it did not. So this is Clinton era legislation. And the Brady bill effectively establishes two core things as we think of it today. The first is the background check system, the NICS system, National Instant Crime.
Yeah.
Something. What does it stand for?
National Instant Criminal
Check System. I don't know.
Check system. National Instant Check System. I think
that sounds true.
Anyway,
so establishes NICS, which is the background check that you undergo when you buy a gun from an FFL in this country, and so it creates that. It also creates a ban on what we think of today as assault weapons, or what the political rhetoric refers to as assault weapons. Sorry to be.
That's where we first see, I think, that term really established.
Oh yeah, big time.
Codified.
AWR. Yeah, that's when.
Yeah,
big time. And it also bans high capacity magazines as defined by that bill. Now, the way the bill is written, though, is it sets up, and when it goes into effect in 1994, and it sets up that the assault weapon, air quotes there, ban and magazine capacity ban will sunset in 2004, a decade later, if Congress doesn't renew it.
Yeah.
So this is sort of a tactic to get it passed. It's like, we don't know if we can get the votes to make this happen. But if we agree to put this 10-year sunset clause in here, then maybe we can gain the votes we need to get this passed. So that's how it goes down.
Yep.
And good news for us, it sunsets and Congress will not renew it, and it goes.
Yep.
I remember. I mean, this is an interesting time, because 1994 to 2004 is really me going into adulthood. And first and foremost, in this period of time, we have the Columbine shooting. It's not the first school shooting, not by a long shot, but it is what I call like the first like major national media attention school shooting takes place. A lot of kids get slaughtered, and none of those shots fired out of a magazine that holds more than 10 rounds. Those boys just reloaded a lot. The other thing that I just, a personal anecdote, I remember buying my first gun, and it was during this period. I bought my first gun like from a dealer as a real adult person in let's think, I would have been December 2003. No, December 2000. 2004, something like that. Anyway, I was right in there as this was getting ready to sunset. Is when it would have been 2001. Is when I went in to buy some magazines for my 22,
Mm-hmm.
my Ruger 1022, and I wanted the
Mm-hmm.
banana magazines.
Mm-hmm.
And the guy behind the counter told me that those were illegal,
Mm-hmm.
and I remember just being pissed.
Yeah. Yeah. You and I grew up in that era. We were teenagers essentially during a lot of this Brady Act timeframe and federal assault weapons ban. And we grew up in that era of hearing people talk about pre-ban versus post-ban,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Well, that's a pre-ban magazine, and so like, you'd go into the gun shop and all you could find were the 10-round versions, right?
yep.
But if you knew somebody that had a pre-ban version,
If you want to pay for it,
then you could purchase those, right? And so guys, I mean, it was a huge. I remember, folks, neighbors,
oh
family
yeah,
members talking about like pre-ban AR magazines that were 30 round. They were just standard USGI 30 round aluminum bodied magazines, and that was a big deal to have the pre-ban mags, right? And then a lot of the things you'd see AR-15s and magazines that were engraved with for government use only because they were manufactured for military or
yeah.
police
Post
contracts,
1994, yeah.
right? And yeah, that's the era we grew up in, man. And thank goodness for that sunset clause because we would have had to still be fighting that one off probably too.
Well, Congress didn't renew it because this is one of those rare times in history where Congress solicited and retained on contract a group to perform research to determine whether or not the Brady bill had reduced gun
Mhm.
violence. And the research came back, no, not a
Mhm.
lick.
Yep.
And so it was like, okay, then like why we're not going to renew this if the research we solicited from a neutral third party says it did nothing to help.
Right. Yep. All right. Now we get to the 2000s. I mean, it sunsetted in 2004, but in 2008, a landmark case comes before the Supreme Court.
The first big kahuna.
Now, understand this is the first big kahuna case since the Miller case, and as we just talked about, the Miller case wasn't even that big of a kahuna because there was nobody even fought for it, and so the District of Columbia versus Heller case. This is, of course, Dick Heller. He's like, hey, I live in DC. DC's got a handgun ban. I think I should be able to own a handgun. And I think that's trigger lock disassembly requirements, a bunch of bull crap. So yeah, he decides to challenge this. And thank goodness for Dick Heller.
He's just
Because
getting started.
yeah, oh yeah. He is just getting started. So he sues. And of course, this goes all the way up to the Supreme Court and in a 5-4 decision with Antonin Scalia writing the majority opinion on that, strikes down DC's handgun ban, and but in so doing affirms the right of individuals to keep and bear arms, and that means arms, and that especially in this case includes handguns, and so therefore DC ban, boom, struck down.
Yeah, because DC's major argument was you're not part of the militia.
Yeah,
Like that was the key
going
point
back
on
to
this
Miller.
case was, hey, is this right? The Second Amendment thing, does it apply only to militias or does it apply to individuals? And I it's crazy to look back and think this was a 5-4 decision. Like this was close. This was one Supreme Court justice made the switch, made the flip here. So, huge,
Hmm.
huge, huge, huge victory and established the first kind of real foundation for stop with this militia nonsense. This, the individual right, like that's the key component here. And look at all of this history, from 1300s up till today, that constantly reestablishes that this is not about a military. This is not about a militia. This is about individual rights over and over and over and
Hmm.
over again. And here it is all laid out for us. And you're going to tell me that that's not what this means? Forget it.
Yep.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
And this is kind of this lays the groundwork for everything else that
Big
follows,
time.
including the way they went about this ruling in Scalia's written opinion. Going back and looking at some of that historical context, that was a big part of it. Referencing many of these things that we've talked about here today, we've pointed out some of those things. That became a framework that we've built upon over the last almost 2 decades now.
Big
This
time.
was 18 years ago. Keep
Yeah.
that in mind.
I mean,
To get to where we are now with Bruin and other,
yeah.
supporting cases.
This is why this is one that you heard Hillary during the 2016 or whatever election cycle. This is why she said Heller got it wrong, right?
Yeah.
Like so, like these gun grabbers will point back to this Heller won. Because there's a second Heller decision coming, they'll point back to Heller 1 and say that's where the Supreme Court screwed up.
Mhm.
There was a tight decision, and it ruled in favor of creating this foundational element of gun rights
Yeah.
that is, it's a snowball rolling down a hill
Yeah.
now.
Again, because her opinion in that was, no, Second Amendment's about militias and collective rights, not individual rights. Yeah, Heller didn't get it wrong, and McDonald agreed. All right, so 2 years after Heller, okay, 2010, the McDonald versus City of Chicago case. This was key because we mentioned a while back about how the Crookshank case, basically one of the logic, some of the logic that was used there was that, hey, we're talking about state or local matters, so it doesn't really apply. If it was a federal thing or a congressional thing, then that's a different animal, and the Second Amendment would apply. McDonald pointed out, because this was a challenge against Chicago's handgun ban, right? Where McDonald got that ruling to basically point out that no, the Second Amendment applies to individual rights, and it applies to, it
is sovereign.
applies as far as federal, state, and local governments may not restrict these rights, the
Yeah.
Second Amendment.
Yeah, it is preemptive and it is sovereign,
Mhm.
and that was key. Yeah, and no, I'm no like judicial expert, but I would imagine that you can see how the D.C. ruling in Heller 1, maybe Chicago's is like, well, that's D.C. It's a federal district, right? No, we're under the jurisdiction of a state, and remember that
Exactly.
Crookshank thing, like so that applies here too, right? Like we can do our own thing, leave us alone,
Yep.
and the U.S. Supreme Court said, no.
Yep.
You
And
can't do that.
there's some important distinctions here with the Heller decision, Heller 1, and McDonald decision. These were specifically dealing with handgun bans.
Yes.
And these rulings were narrow in that respect as well. So they were basically affirming that, hey, it's an individual right, okay? And handguns are primarily an individual's tool, something that's mostly used for personal defense. And that's relevant because we're not talking about community level or collective or militia level type stuff. We're talking about individual rights, and that means handguns that are personal defense tools. And these rulings dealt with those issues narrowly in that regard. And so that's basically what has forced all jurisdictions nationwide to at least, and they do their best, they do their darnest to restrict it as much as they can and to go after things as narrowly as they can with respect to certain handgun restrictions or bans. But the Heller 1 decision and McDonald decisions basically forced all jurisdictions nationwide to at least recognize that individuals have a right to possess a handgun.
Yeah,
So,
key, critical. These were the big turning
yeah.
points in the modern era of gun rights.
Yeah. Then we have the Heller 2 decision. This came just a year after McDonald and 3 years after Heller 1. Dick Heller went back again against DC because what happened, of course, after Heller 1, DC basically, wants to try to tighten things where they can as much as they can. Of course, they also had continued bans on assault weapons and magazines over 10 rounds. Now, the DC Circuit Court upheld nearly all of those laws or those local regulations or whatever. I don't know what they call them in DC. Typically, on a city level, we'd call it an ordinance, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, but the interesting thing here is, and of course, this is where Bruin's going to come back into play about a decade later. The DC Circuit Court, of course, used the classic two-step I say classic now by today's standards, intermediate scrutiny framework that circuit courts nationwide would then adopt. This is where we start seeing more challenges against assault weapon bans, magazine bans, different things that people challenge those laws, and you have these federal courts that are like, well, we're going to apply this either a strict or an intermediate scrutiny to these standards to, kind of weigh these things on a scale as far as, well, how strong or compelling of a government interest
Yeah,
and public safety
importance to public safety is the
exists here
constant.
relevant to the right. And that became kind of this new standard for weighing a lot of these challenges in
Yeah,
court.
yeah.
Uh,
If there's a demonstrable need of this for public safety, then it's an appropriate restriction on someone's Second Amendment rights.
yeah,
That's kind of the scrutiny that begins to be applied until Bruin.
yep, yeah. So that's an important thing to understand, that and I went back and had to do a little bit of research, Jacob, on this, because I was curious, like, where did this sort of strict or intermediate, this kind of two-step approach, like, first it was, we have to first look at a law and weigh in the balance, is that dealing with an individual right or not? Okay.
Mhm.
And then two, okay, where's the government's interest in this? And do we apply an intermediate or a strict scrutiny here? Strict scrutiny meaning that we really uh, view the government's interest quite strictly, versus intermediate, where it's like more of this a balanced beam approach, where it's like, hey, we just got to weigh these interests in the balance and try to balance government's interest in public safety with individual right to possess or have or use or whatever, right? And that basically started, we saw this trend nationwide where these cases would just sort of get stalled out, because courts were like, yeah, we think that there's a compelling government interest or public safety and involved. And so, you know, we'd see these assault weapon bans in certain jurisdictions and magazine capacity limitations upheld. And that's kind of what came out of Heller too.
Yeah, not super favorable.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting there. By the way, that was a circuit court ruling. That was a DC Circuit Court that ruled this, and Justice Brett Kavanaugh was a part of that. It was a 3-judge panel. He was the minority. There were two judges that voted, obviously, uh, with the majority there. Brett Kavanaugh, though, was in the minority. He wrote an interesting dissenting opinion here that, if you go and read it, it's basically a preview of Bruin. He made the argument in his dissenting opinion about how we need to look back at the historical context and be, as part of how we evaluate these challenges, these laws. So kind of cool to
Nice little
see
preview.
how that's come full circle now that he, of course, just a few years later gets put into the Supreme Court and is playing a huge role in this there. So now we go from, there's a few other cases here and there popped up, but big cases, and that's what we're here to talk about today, are these big, big events, the biggest events of the Second Amendment in its history. Now we come to New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, 2022.
Yeah. So the issue at root here in this case is that what we used to refer to as may issue versus shall issue,
Yeah.
as it relates to concealed carry permits. So the what it really comes down to is the idea of, does the Second Amendment protect your right to conceal or carry or have, not even conceal, does the Second Amendment protect your right to have a gun on your person outside of your home in public, one way or another? Like, is that protected as a right? And New York says no, is not. Like, Heller and McDonald said you have a individual right to a gun, for self-defense, but we think that applies to your home. In public, we're going to give you no legal means to be armed, and we think that's perfectly within Constitution. And obviously, the plaintiff doesn't agree, so that goes to the U.S. Supreme Court, and that's where we get Bruin.
Yeah, huge landmark case. If we were kind of weighing these things, we don't have to put them on a.
Well, they build on
podium,
each other, so it's hard
They
to
really
them,
do.
right?
That's true. But Heller was huge, and probably because it was like the first really significant thing, like, ever, especially in favor of the Second Amendment. Bruin is also just a huge landmark
Massive.
case.
Yeah, because spoiler alert, the U.S. Supreme Court says, yeah, you do have a right to
Yeah.
have a gun on you in public.
Yeah. And the other huge huge part of Bruin was basically doing away with this silly two-step intermediate scrutiny test that federal courts were using for years now at this point.
The Heller 2 was in 2011.
Right.
Yep.
And so that had become the standard, and Bruin did away with that by saying, no, the standard here is we look back at the text of the Second Amendment, and we look at the history. We look at the context with that and where it came from and what the framers intended. And well, how do we know what they intended? Well, we look at, what were the books they were reading? What were the historical frameworks they were operating within? What were the cases they referenced and other cases that were referenced, going back to, we'd already talked about them here today, the English Bill of Rights, and going back to that Statute of Northampton all the way back in the 1300s and pointing all these things out. That's what Bruin really honed in on and clarified on as far as how are the courts supposed to evaluate and look at these laws when they come before us for review. And that's having a huge impact on things. In fact, there's an interesting statistic here, Jacob. Bruin has triggered an explosion of Second Amendment lawsuits.
Yeah.
Roughly 680 cases a year. So on average, 680 cases a year. So challenges on Second Amendment issues have been brought before the courts since Bruin versus 74 cases a year before.
Makes total sense, right? It's like, oh, by that standard, like all this stuff that's happening like all over the place is unconstitutional.
Yeah.
And we think we can win the fight.
Yeah.
Because Bruin said that in order for them to win, this is what they have to show, and they got nothing. So let's go to battle.
Exactly. That's why this is such a landmark case. And I appreciate what you said, and I completely agree as far as like each of these, the Heller, McDonald, Heller 2, and Bruin have all they've just been, and we see that framework just kind of, as I mentioned a moment ago about how Scalia's opinion in Heller 1, where that's when he first started really going back and looking at some of that old case law and English law and all of those historical contexts that he then applied in that case, and that was just built upon all the way up here now to Bruin. One more case here we're going to talk about in the historical context. This happened 2 years ago. This is the United States versus Rahimi case. This has been pretty notable, and this was this is not what we'd call a win necessarily, right? But this was a law that is the first real test of the Bruin standard, and that's why this is notable. And Bruin is not perfect either. We have to recognize that too. In fact, there's people on both sides, both on the more liberal side that say Bruin got it wrong and Bruin's not clear enough, or it's causing all kinds of problems. I've seen some things from some more liberal justices that are basically criticizing Bruin because of it complicating matters for the federal court system, and people on the other side saying that it didn't quite get it fully right because it's that this is an example of it. So the Rahimi case. Basically, this was a domestic violence restraining order case, so a red flag type law, that kind of thing. Okay, so a domestic violence restraining order, and we don't have to go into the specifics of the case, but what came out of this was a ruling of 8-1, and ironically, the only dissenting justice was Justice Thomas, who wrote the Bruin majority opinion, right? And basically, the Rahimi case suggests that the lower courts had been applying Bruin's historical test, or am I getting this wrong backwards? Justice Thomas is the one that basically said, "No, you're getting it wrong."
He's a Bruin purist,
right? He's a absolutely Bruin purist. He wrote to clarify, "No, you are trying to apply this too narrowly," whereas the majority opinion justices on the Rahimi case, he's like, you got this wrong. You went back and basically took parts of two different laws from way back and tried to mix them into one to use as an analog for this Rahimi case. And he's like, that's not the intent of Bruin, and that's not the intent of the Second Amendment. He's like, and so it's an interesting thing here to see kind of how that swung like that. But why Rahimi's relevant is because it's helping, at least in some regard, provide some clarification, whether we agree with the majority in that case or not. But even in Justice Thomas's own words, we can gain some more clarification on what Bruin is really all about.
Yeah, I think that this is the first place where we've basically seen the Supreme Court say you can remove someone's Second Amendment rights, not just because you can demonstrate a historical perfect similarity to the law you have now. If you can just get close, like we want a historical analog, not a historical like duplicate, exact replica of the current restriction.
Yeah.
And that was I think so. It kind of, from a gun rights perspective, the argument could be made that Rahimi was not positive, that it sort of pulled back it's almost like Bruin, pushed it really far down the road. Like, hey, if you can't show that there was some perfect historical example of what the restriction you're imposing today, then forget it. Then Rahimi kind of pulled back, like, well, I mean, maybe not a perfect historical, example, but just something that's close.
It reined it back a little bit.
It reined it back a little bit.
And I can see that. I may not entirely agree with where the court stood on this, and obviously Justice Thomas didn't at all. But that's kind of what that's the whole point here, is that we see Bruin, like you said, just pushed it way far down the road, and Rahimi's like, hold on here just a little bit.
Yeah. Some restrictions are okay. We don't need a perfect historical example of the exact same restriction. We need a historical analog, to justify this.
That's fair. Yeah. That's where we are today, and that sets the framework for where we are today. And we are seeing a whole bunch of cases right now working through the court system. I mean, we've got things testing the courts on purchasing of handguns of 18 to 21-year-olds. We got magazine capacity limitations. We got assault weapon type stuff, AR-15s, whatever. A number of things working their way through the courts or sitting in the courts, or in some cases have been turned down by the Supreme Court. They've received those cases and they said, no, we're not going to take that right now. But here's some big news as of just yesterday.
2 days ago? Yeah, yesterday.
I think it was yesterday. Maybe it was 2 days ago. But just in the last 24, 48 hours, the Supreme Court is now going to hear 2 cases combined into one. They're combining the Viramontes versus Cook County case. This is all out of Illinois, kind of like the McDonald case, and the Grant versus Higgins case. They're both AR-15 related cases.
Yeah. So the question that they're going to answer is, can a specific type of firearm, i.e. the AR-15, be banned or not?
Semi-automatic rifles with detachable magazines.
Right. This may or may not also address magazine capacity limitation questions.
It's a relevant question, and in some of those cases, I think in the Higgins case, one of those cases, I think it touches on that. The feeling I'm getting from reading some other online legal analysis of this is that the court's probably going to just tackle the AR-15 question, and the court generally tries to be as narrow as possible in such things anyway. That's just like a standard practice. Like they try to just, what's the issue before us? We're going to go after that issue and not try to. It's very rare that
with its application, with its context.
Right. It's very rare the Supreme Court issues rulings that are like super broad, super wide, all encompassing. Not that it doesn't happen. It's very rare. And so it's possible. It's possible. I don't think it's terribly likely that they're going to also pick up as part of these 2 cases anything to do with magazine capacities. But I think assuming, and I do think the court is favorable in this regard, because especially you still have Justice Thomas, and Alito, and Kavanaugh certainly. Those are certainly the 3 that are pretty pure on the Second Amendment issues. Some of the others are also pretty strong, but I think the court is leaning very favorably on the issue of probably coming down on the right side as we see it with regards to AR-15s or semi-automatic rifles.
Yeah, looks positive.
That will create a natural consequence of, well, okay, if this gun, this tool, is a protected arm and is, we have a right to possess, therefore can't be restricted or banned. Then the tools, it's in common use, for instance, then the tools that also support using that arm, such as
Magazine.
standard capacity magazines, 30-round magazines, for instance, should also be a part of that. Well, if that's not ruled on in these
Decision.
Viramontes or Grant versus Higgins cases, it's going to probably be a kind of a second
A near
order.
future thing.
It's going to have to come up as well. So I don't know what the intent of the court here is. Maybe they have no intent on the magazines thing. I don't know. I don't know where they stand on that. But I'm glad to see that they're going to take up a semi-automatic rifle case.
This is significant because we're seeing in a very short period of time a lot of Second Amendment related cases.
Yeah.
We've already had man, I'm struggling. We've had 2 U.S. Supreme Court decisions in the last 60 days related to the Second Amendment. We had a Hawaii ruling. We had struggling with the other one, the marijuana one that just came
That's
out.
the
It's with an H.
Yep.
Hamani?
We just talked about it. Something like that.
Yeah. So that ruling just came out as well. And now we're taking up the AR-15 question. This is unprecedented if you look at kind of a historical view of the U.S. Supreme Court.
Yep.
Of course, it's also unprecedented the number of lawsuits that are being filed, right? And the number of issues that are being brought up. Wait, based on the Bruin, is this constitutional? Is this constitutional? Is this constitutional? This is bubbling up, and the U.S. Supreme Court's getting busy. And this is the time you thank your lucky stars that the right people were appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court in recent history.
Yeah, for sure. I think this last session is the first time ever that the Supreme Court issued opinions on more than one Second Amendment case.
Yeah, and now we're picking up another one.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So big deal. I'd say the future looks bright, and especially in light of the last 20 years of court rulings, especially where we see this boom, 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 all the way up to Bruin. That I think our future is bright for the Second Amendment, and I'm proud of the fact that, all the imperfections aside of our nation, certainly there's perfections of many, imperfections of many, there and problems and challenges and all kinds of things, issues. But we still live in, I think, the greatest country on earth. And I'm proud to live here. I'm proud that we even have the rights that we do have.
Yes.
Proud that I have, I'm carrying my gun right here. You carrying your gun?
Naturally.
Where else in the world could we be living the way we live our lives, carrying our guns, shooting, going to the range, going to shoot, yes, there's some countries where you can do some of those things, but you can't do all the things like we're able to do here in the US of A.
Not even close.
And so it's pretty remarkable. The intent here today was to break down for you guys, and I know it was a lot. It's been a 2-hour episode. I knew it was going to be a mega episode, but I thought it was an important one to do. And I think a perfect time to, in this 250th birthday, period of our nation, to look back and establish the context and the history, the story behind our nation and how we got to where we are today with respect to the Second Amendment, and to honor that a little bit. And I hope we've accomplished that at least somewhat here in our episode today.
It's also a reminder that you have to continue to exercise and protect your rights if you want to maintain them.
Absolutely.
So, keep doing your part to support the organization. 700 lawsuits, like someone's got to pay all those attorneys. Where's that coming from? That's coming from people like us who are, supporting all those organizations. So keep doing your part.
We talked about in the episode about what happens when people don't appreciate or exercise those rights. We talked about what happened with the National Firearms Act,
they laid
and we're
down
paying
on it.
for it today.
Yep.
We just didn't think it was a big deal. People didn't care. They slept on it a little bit. They just kind of, doesn't affect me, so I'm not going to worry about it. And what we know from history, on the legislative side especially, is that the anti-gunners will try to take, even if it's just an inch at a time, they will take a little more, they'll take a little more, they'll take a little bit more. We have a lot to be thankful for and a lot of wins on the judicial side of the equation. but the fight's not over, and it's going to continue. And when the courts rule a certain way, the anti-gunners go another way, and they try another tactic. So the future's bright, and there's a lot of great things happening for us. But the fight's not over, and we can't sit on our hands and do nothing. We need to respect our Second Amendment and fight for it.
Game on. Let's go to battle.
Happy birthday, America. Happy 250 years. Our nation's not perfect. It never was. I think we could say it was intended to be perfect, but the founders knew what they were creating was not perfect, nor would it be perfect. In fact, some of them thought that it would only last a few decades at most.
It was referred to as the American experiment.
It was an experiment, and here it is, still experimenting. I'm thankful for it. I hope you are too. We wish you all a happy 250th birthday, America. May you spend it doing those things that you enjoy most, enjoying your freedoms with people that you care the most about. Have a great weekend. Be safe. Don't blow off your hands with fireworks or anything.
Yeah, don't light a forest fire.
Yeah, or shoot yourself with your gun, because you're having too much fun. Don't drink and shoot. Don't drink and drive. All that stuff. Okay. We just hope that you have a wonderful, safe, enjoyable holiday weekend here as it's coming up here in just a few days. Don't forget about our Happy Birthday America sale. Go to concealedcarry.com/HBA for details. Pick yourself up one of those. It's the only way you can get one. Okay. To get one of those commemorative 250th birthday America coins, you got to go to and participate in our Happy Birthday America sale. All orders will get one of those coins. And join Guardian Nation, guardiannation.com if you want to learn more so you can take advantage of the biggest deals. Well,
there it is.
Until next time. A reminder to train right, train often, and train safe.
So you can fight hard, fight fast, and fight true. Take care.